Good morning. This is a summary of chapter 12. It's called A Sexual Turn. This chapter starts with an example from friends to pressure each other to perform a sexual act on a boy. So, a group of girls putting some pressure to do the sexual act. It wasn't even the boy pressuring the girl, it was the girls putting pressure on each other. And the girl who was getting pressured wasn't actually interested in the boy or in performing that act, but she felt the pressure from her friends because she wanted to be part of her friends' group. So it's interesting how sometimes these things are more about belonging to a group than about anything else. Um, so Gordon Neufeld says that sex often isn't about sex. In the first point, like he makes a list of reasons that it can be about. So it can be about a hunger to be desired. Um, I think it's interesting to think about each of these points a little bit and see, where we have fit in ourselves, or just to kind of understand and think about the points, because it'll be interesting as your kids get older to really understand where that desire to have sex sometimes comes from, that it's not even about the sexual act, it can be about all kinds of underlying reasons. So yeah, so a hunger to be desired. So maybe if people get that elsewhere, they don't then feel like they have to have sex early on. An escape from boredom or loneliness. I was kind of surprised about boredom. That seems like a strange thing to do when you're just bored, but I guess that can be the case for some people. Um, a way to stake territory or possession. So I guess sometimes a teenager might feel like, okay, if I go ahead and have sex with this person, then he or she's mine. Um, an attempt to lock into an exclusive relationship with another. So again, like a hope of like, oh, if I go ahead and do that, maybe that person is like mine, maybe on a more permanent basis. Um, it can be a symbol of status or recognition. I guess if it's the hottest girl in the school or whatever, or boy, then they feel like they've conquered that person. It's a status. Um, it can be about belonging or fitting in. So, kind of like the first thing I talked about with the girls putting pressure on each other, um, then, sometimes a girl might, or a boy can happen the same way, might do it just to be like the friends. It can be about dominance or submission. So, sometimes a boy or a girl will put well, yeah, pressure on the partner just to be like, the one who has, like, again, kind of about conquering. And like with the attachment, how there's always one person or taking turns sometimes, but it's hierarchical, right? So one person might be in charge and the other person is submissive, or one person is caretaking and the other person is submissive in a more positive way, is getting taken care of. Um, so it can also be dominant and submissive, where one person is like just wanting to kind of rule over someone, and you can do that in a sexual way too, of course. So another reason is to please someone, um, just to do it for the sake of the other person, to make them happy. It can happen for a lack of boundaries, the inability to say no. It's interesting that sometimes people, often women, are not as embarrassed to actually have sex as they're embarrassed to speak about it, which includes saying no. So that's also something, when your kids are little and you talk openly about the different body parts and everything and not make them feel so like ashamed and weird talking about sex, then and you respecting their boundaries when they don't want to hug, or when they don't want to give a kiss to grandma if they don't have to, right? So it starts early on where you can show them that it's okay to say no, um, or if they don't want to be tickled anymore or something, right? Like you can early on listen to them where it's like about their body and their boundaries, and then they know it's okay to say no, and the other person is actually supposed to listen about that. Um, and he says, of course, sex can also express love, heartfelt passion, and intimacy, which is how it should be, of course. The other reasons are just like reasons of insecurity lots of times. So, in the lives of adolescents, it is often an unfulfilled attachment need. So, if the attachment need, the primary attachment with the parents, if that's not there, then they're looking for another attachment. And um, once they're adolescents, they're interested in sex and can think of that as a way to get attachment. Okay, so the age of the first sexual activity is becoming younger and younger, which is kind of scary for parents to hear. In Canada, a study published in 2000 found that more than 13% of girls in the 1990s had sex before they were 15, double compared to the 1980s. Sometimes young teenagers think it's not even sex when they have oral sex, especially if their friends are all doing it too. So it seemed like there was a time where like it was all over TV shows and stuff where it was like a fad, where it was cool, or I don't know what they were thinking it was really, but where fairly young girls were giving oral sex to boys. I don't know if they're still doing that or if that's still a thing, but it's alarming, right? And they seem to have gotten younger in doing those kind of things. And I mean, there are adults who say that too. Like, let's use Bill Clinton as an example, who also denied that he had sexual relations because it wasn't like intercourse. So some people kind of use that as an excuse that oh it's nothing, but it is, right? So the lack of real intimacy, when young people or any age really engage in those kind of activities with no real depth to it, leaves them feeling like there's something missing. Not all peer-oriented children are sexually active, of course, or act out their sexuality in the same way, but peer-oriented adolescents are sexual beings who might use sex in an attempt to form an attachment, like he said in the beginning. So the 6 ways of attachment that we learned about in chapter 2 can also apply to trying to attach through sexual activity. In peer culture, especially, the more superficial ways of attachment have the most appeal because they don't require to show vulnerability. So the first way of attaching is through physical senses. Senses like smell and touch and all of that. That's not the most, that's the least vulnerable. And so that's often like it fits with sexuality, right? If that's all you're attaching by through physical senses instead of like depth and feeling. So then the next one is sameness. conforming to values of the peer group. So sometimes it's an issue that they want to be the same as their peers, so they go along with doing the same sexual things that the peers are doing, even though they don't really want to yet. I guess it can also be the same, you want to be the same as the guy, but lots of times it is about the peers. So the third way of attaching is belonging and loyalty. So yeah, it could be that you want to belong with the boy, but sometimes it's also that they want to belong with the peer group again, and whatever the peer group is doing, they want to do too. So, and then the fourth way of attaching is being significant to someone. It's usually a more vulnerable way of attaching, is significance. But it can also mean to please someone, to be part of a group, or having a certain status within the group. And then the two highest forms of attachment, they don't even usually come into it with the peer-oriented kids, because they're just too vulnerable, where you have to go really into depth of feeling. So current styles, makeup, and demeanor promote the sexualization of young girls who are in no way ready for mature sexual activity. So, like music videos, all the kind of stuff that's out there that girls want to copy lots of times. There's a lot of stuff that it hypersexualizes girls, and they don't even know lots of times when they're young what consequences that can have. Sex is a potent bonding agent, so like a human contact cement. It evokes powerful emotions of attachment in the brain, and it pulls the participants into highly vulnerable territory. So what sex binds together cannot be separated without some pain. This can induce emotional scarring and hardening. So sometimes, the young teenagers might think, oh, well, this is just fun or whatever. But they don't realize that there is a psychological aspect, even if you're trying to not feel that. Like, it's hard not to feel it. It's just a biological thing that happens. Not even in the short term does the engaging in sex leave the emotionally defended teenager emotionally unharmed. The less consciously affected we are, the more wounded we may be on the unconscious level. So, even people think, oh, whatever, it's no big deal, it's just fun. Underneath it all, on the unconscious level, they still get scarred by it too. So one of the costs of emotional hardening is that sex will just become a non-vulnerable attachment activity without true intimacy, as much as that's possible. Sometimes people think that it's progress, that now young people are able to talk about sex in a more open way than past generations. But if they're defended against vulnerability and sex isn't something intimate for them anymore, it makes it less vulnerable to talk about. It is a good thing if you can talk about sex in an open way, with talking about the feelings and all of that. But if they're just talking about sex like it's nothing, then it shows that they're hardened emotionally against feeling the feelings that they should be feeling when they're getting into an intimate relationship. So although adolescents often engage in sex to become closer, they don't count on getting stuck on each other. Some find themselves attempting the inevitable pain of separation by desperately clinging, like they find themselves attempting to avoid the inevitable pain of separation by desperately clinging to each other. Others will feel trapped by a feeling of closeness they didn't expect to feel, and try to get back out of the relationship as soon as they can. Some will find their emerging personalities swallowed up in the relationship and don't know their own minds anymore without consulting their partner. There are adults like that too, right? Who've been in a relationship for a long time and don't even know who they are anymore. That's why it's important that we kind of become our own person first before we get into a relationship. So, sex of adolescence seldom comes with the protection of commitment and therefore feels psychologically unprotected. A person can't keep getting married, even though it's not like really married, but like married and divorced over and over and over without any impact. So, it's not a real marriage, but like it has a psychological impact. So every time you get into a sexual relationship and then it doesn't end up working, this whole like emotional feeling of bonding that goes with having sex and then it tearing apart again has a big impact on people, whether they think it does or not. Um, so the safest sex from the perspective of attachment and vulnerability would occur not as a way of forming a relationship, but in the context of relationship that is already satisfying and secure. So, so instead of them thinking, oh, if I have sex, then this other person is gonna stay with me, and using sex as a way to create a relationship, you should already be in a secure relationship before you take it to the next level and have sex, because there needs to be trust there and some intimacy there in an emotional way already so that you're less likely to get hurt. Sex should be the final attachment act for exclusivity as a couple, not the first one to become a couple. For this, you need what peer oriented adolescents lack, which is maturity. Okay. Maturation is a prerequisite for sex in a number of ways. The first fruit of maturation is separateness as an individual. You need to know your own mind to extend an invitation to someone else or to decline one. On the other hand, an immature peer oriented bully's fantasies are not of invitation but of domination. Maturation is required to have mixed feelings. The desire to belong to another has to coexist with the desire to be your own person. You also need to be able to consider the present and the future. On the one hand, the psychologically immature, oh, on the other hand, sorry, the psychologically immature only think of the pleasure in the moment. To make good decisions, you have to be able to feel fear and desire simultaneously. So, yeah, that's how babies are made sometimes accidentally because it feels good right now and then they don't think of anything else anymore. And are too scared to ask, for the boy to use a condom or whatever because they don't know each other well enough. They don't feel secure with each other. And comfortable and trust each other to have the conversations they should be able to have. Adolescents generally lack the wisdom, insight, and impulse control to be safely entrusted to get into a sexual relationship. So it just would be better for everybody involved to wait. We could impose structure and limitations on them to keep their sexual behavior within safe bounds and act as their consultants in decisions about sex. But with peer oriented adolescents, we lack the power and connection to do so. Despite sexual education, teenage pregnancies are highest in the United States, followed by Britain and Canada. So it shows that just talking to them, if they're not really connected to us, it's not enough. Like what we really need to have is the connection. Adults typically try to deal with hypersexuality of peer oriented adolescents the same way they look at bullying and aggression by focusing on the interactions between them. We try to effect change in behavior through reprimands, teaching, rewards, and punishments. There's little we can do as long as they're peer oriented. To make a difference in their sexuality, we must first bring them back to the place where they truly belong with us. So if they're connected to us, then we can lead through example and by talking to them and if if they're not connected to us, then they're going to take their cues from their friends, and those cues aren't always the best. So again, we're back to, we need to have that attachment so that we can have influence on our kids.